bone, and you guys are going to be responsible to memorize all of the 206 bones that are in the human body. There will be a practical involved in this chapter. So we're going to just start by kind of breaking down the skeleton so that you guys can start learning the different parts. So there are basically two different parts of the skeleton. There's the axial skeleton, and we learned this in the last chapter. And that is going to include the skull, the vertebral column, and the bony thorax, which is basically the rib cage area. So this is just a picture to show you what is involved in the axial skeleton. So there are lots of different bones. I mean, 80 of the 206 bones are included in this section. And one of the things, I know that 206 bones sounds quite daunting, but when you really look at it, there are many different vertebra. There are different types of vertebra, but just many different vertebra. So you only need to be able to identify one of each type. And then with ribs, there are 12 ribs on each side, so 24, and that's 24 different bones in the human body. So it's really not as bad as it sounds. The skull is the body's most complex structure, and it is formed by the cranium. The cranium is what houses the brain itself, and then facial bones. The facial bones are the ones that are going to basically give us, most of our characteristics, and also provides openings for the passage of air and food. We also have to be able to anchor muscles so that we can, form some sort of expression. When we are just talking about the skull, so that's going to be the cranium and the face, there are many different bones, and we're going to talk about basically the skull bones in kind of one little package. The frontal bone is right where you would, if you were going to touch your forehead, it is going to be that bone that you are touching. And whenever you see the word articulates, that just means that it comes into contact and makes a joint with another bone. So it articulates posteriorly with the parietal bones via a coronal suture. A suture is, we think of sutures as like stitches, but in the skeleton, they are the articulation point between skull bones that are basically immovable joints. So the yellow bone that you're looking at here is your frontal bone. It's a very large bone, but it makes up your forehead. The parietal bone, bones are very large. You have two parietal bones that are fused together, and they make up, if you're going to touch the sides of your head kind of towards the top, that is where the parietal bones are located on each side. Now the parietal bones articulate or make a joint with a lot of different bones in your skull. And so there are 4 sutures, which are those movable joints that articulate with other bones. So you have the coronal suture. And if you guys can remember, there was something called a coronal plane in the body. It was also called a frontal plane. But that is going to be the articulation between parietal bones and the frontal bone. And so it's going to form kind of like a frontal plane through the skull. Then sagittal, we should remember there was also a sagittal plane that cut the body into right and left portions. And so the parietal bone, where they articulate, there are 2 parietal bones, they articulate at the top of the head, and that is where you would find the sagittal suture. There's also something called a lambdoid suture, and this is where the parietal bones meet the occipital bone, which is in the back, the very back of the skull. And then something called a squamosal or squamous suture, And that's where parietal and temporal bones meet, and the parietal bones are above the temporal bones on both sides of the skull. The occipital bone is the portion of the skull that if you were to smack somebody in the back of the head, you're hitting the occipital bone. The temporal bones are below the parietal bones on both sides. And so where your ear canal is, your ear canal goes through the parietal bone. So your parietal bone, I'm sorry, I apologize, your temporal bone is where your ear canals are. They're below your parietal bone. And if you touch your, where you think your temple is, that would be the temporal bone. And so this is where the temporal bone, they've actually taken it out, so it kind of looks funny in this picture, but when you look at the whole skull together, you can see it's kind of on the side of the head, the lower side of the head. Then you've got something called a sphenoid bone. So now we're into the skull. If I were to take the skull cap off, you would see the sphenoid bone. And I'll show you guys on the actual skull. I'll show you where all of these things are. But it's a butterfly-shaped bone that is that spans the width of the base of the skull. And it forms a central wedge that articulates with all other cranial bones. So it is considered to be the keystone bone of the cranium. You might want to highlight that. And that just means that it, like a keystone, it would be the stone in an arch that kind of holds everything together. So the sphenoid bone kind of holds everything together in the cranium itself. And it articulates with all the other bones. And this is what it looks like. This is why they call it a butterfly shape. And you can see even that some of the processes are called wings. And last but not least for today is the ethmoid bone. And the ethmoid bone is the most deep of all the skull bones. And you might want to highlight that. It lies between the sphenoid and nasal bone. The nasal bone is considered to be a facial bone. And when it says most deep, remember that term, it's actually the most inside bone of the cranium. So it's the furthest away from the skin. And this, where you can see in the, it kind of looks funny here because it doesn't really look like anything. But when you look at it in the skull, it is kind of behind that nasal bone in that general area.